In the fourth quarter of 2025 alone, Ford wrote down $15.5 billion in a single quarter, mostly the cost of admitting that an entire strategic bet on electric vehicles hadn't worked out the way the company planned. One quarter, $15.5 billion. That's not a bad product recall or a lawsuit. That's the price of building an assembly line for a future that arrived slower and looked different than the plan assumed it would. And that's the part almost nobody understands about owning an auto manufacturing plant. You're not really running a factory. You're placing a multi-billion-dollar bet on what people will want to drive 5 to 10 years from now, pouring the concrete and installing the robots today, and finding out if you guessed right only after it's far too late to take the bet back. Start with what it actually costs to build the thing in the first place. A modern assembly plant designed to produce around 250,000 vehicles a year carries a price tag somewhere between $1.5 and $2.5 billion, covering land, the building itself, and the machinery needed to actually build a car. Automation and robotics alone for a single assembly line can run $300 to $500 million on top of that. Welding stations, conveyor systems, calibration equipment, all of it engineered to move a vehicle body through hundreds of precise steps without a human hand touching most of them. And here's the detail that trips up anyone underestimating this business: that equipment is built for a specific vehicle platform. When General Motors decided to retool one of its Michigan plants for electric vehicle production, the bill came to roughly $4 billion, not because the building changed, but because almost everything inside it had to. The robots that weld a steel frame together are not the robots that assemble a battery pack. You don't upgrade your way from one to the other. You tear out what you built and start again, and every single day the plant sits retooling instead of producing is a day of zero revenue against debt payments that don't pause for anybody. Now add the workforce running that plant once it's operational, because labor in this industry is not a simple hourly wage line. In late 2023, after a 6-week strike that idled plants across the country, the United Auto Workers reached new contracts with Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis that reshaped the entire cost structure of American vehicle assembly. Starting wages rose 68% to over $28 an hour. Top wages climbed toward $40 an hour once cost of living adjustments, reinstated for the first time since being suspended during the 2009 financial crisis, were factored in. Ford alone estimated the deal would add $8.8 billion in costs over the life of the contract, working out to roughly $850 to $900 of added cost on every single vehicle it builds. General Motors put its number at $9.3 billion, and that's the cost of the agreement itself. The strike that preceded it cost the three companies over $5 billion combined in lost production before a single new wage was even paid. Because when the plant floor stops, revenue stops with it, but the mortgage on the robots does not. If you want to see how a single labor contract actually reshapes a plant's per vehicle profit margin line by line, that's the kind of breakdown worth building. So let me know in the comments and I'll put that together next. Let's put real numbers on how little room this leaves. Picture a plant producing 250,000 vehicles a year at an average price of $40,000 each, $10 billion in annual revenue. Parts and materials typically eat somewhere around 70% of that, $7 billion, before labor is even counted. Labor, at the new post-2023 contract rates, might run another $1 billion to $1.2 billion on a plant this size once wages, benefits, and overtime are included. Add debt service on the $2 billion plant itself, spread over its useful life, plus energy, logistics, and warranty costs, and you're often left with an operating margin in the single digits, sometimes 5 to 8% in a good year for a traditional gas-powered vehicle line. Now apply that same math to an EV line still early in its cost curve, where battery costs alone can eat into a much larger share of the parts bill, and that 5 to 8% margin can flip negative before you've accounted for a single supply chain hiccup or labor dispute. That's the entire reason Ford's Model E division can lose billions of dollars a year, while Ford's traditional gas and truck divisions remain solidly profitable at the very same company, using very similar plants, built by very similar workers, just months apart on the product calendar. Here's the part that makes this business genuinely fragile in a way most manufacturing isn't. A modern vehicle isn't built by one company, it's assembled from parts made by thousands of different suppliers scattered across dozens of countries, and the plant only runs as fast as the slowest, most vulnerable link in that entire chain. The industry organizes these suppliers in tiers. Tier 1 suppliers ship finished components, seats, dashboards, entire engine assemblies directly to the automaker. But those Tier 1 suppliers depend on Tier 2 suppliers for raw materials and subcomponents, who in turn depend on Tier 3 suppliers further down, often small specialized manufacturers nobody outside the industry has ever heard of. A single automaker might rely, directly or indirectly, on tens of thousands of these companies across a finished vehicle, and the assembly plant has almost no visibility into how fragile the bottom of that chain actually is until something breaks. A typical vehicle contains somewhere around 1,400 semiconductor chips, controlling everything from the brakes to the infotainment screen, and when a global chip shortage hit in 2021, triggered by a mix of pandemic shutdowns, a fire at a supplier plant in Japan, and a drought that slowed chip production in Taiwan, the auto industry lost an estimated $210 billion in revenue and roughly 9.5 million vehicles of production that year alone. Not because any single automaker did anything wrong, because a $2 chip from a single Tier 3 supplier wasn't available, and a $2 billion assembly plant sat there unable to finish a single car without it. That is the uncomfortable truth of this business. The size and sophistication of your own plant means almost nothing if a supplier you've never heard of on the other side of the planet has a bad month. And now, layer the newest, least predictable risk on top of everything else, the EV transition itself, which is not a smooth technology upgrade. It's a bet on consumer demand that keeps moving the goalposts on the companies that already committed billions to it. Look at Ford's own numbers. Model E, its electric vehicle division, lost $2.2 billion in 2022, $4.7 billion in 2023. $5.1 billion in 2024, and another $4.8 billion in 2025, adding up to roughly $17 billion in cumulative losses in just 4 years. That's before counting the $15.5 billion impairment charge in the final quarter of 2025 alone, tied directly to canceled EV programs, a scrapped 3-row electric SUV, and a production halt on the F-150 Lightning, one of the very models that had once been marketed as proof the transition was working. General Motors missed its own 2024 E5 production target, landing at 189,000 units against a goal of 200,000. Toyota pushed back its planned US EV production to 2026. Volvo abandoned its pledge to go fully electric by 2030. This isn't one company making a bad call. It's an entire industry that poured tens of billions of dollars into retooled plants and battery capacity based on demand projections that, so far, real consumers simply haven't matched, and the machinery doesn't care whether the market cooperates. The debt service on a retooled EV line is exactly the same whether you sell 200,000 vehicles or 100,000. Curious how many of you have an EV plant or a UAW facility near where you live? Drop the state below, because it might shape which company's numbers I pull apart next. Put these 4 pressures together, and you start to see why so few businesses require this much capital just to find out years later whether the bet paid off. Billions in fixed machinery tied to one specific vehicle platform. Labor costs that can jump by nearly $1 billion in a single negotiation and cost billions more if that negotiation turns into a strike. A supply chain so distributed that a single overseas supplier can freeze a plant that cost $2 billion to build. And now, a technology transition where the entire industry guessed the timeline wrong at the same time, together, with real money already spent and no way to quietly take it back. So here's the honest picture underneath the assembly line. The car coming off the end of that line was never really the product, in the sense that matters financially. The real product is the company's ability to correctly predict what people will want to drive years before it's built, survive a labor negotiation without losing a quarter's worth of production, and absorb a supply chain shock that starts with a single factory fire on the other side of the world, all while a multi-billion-dollar plant sits there generating debt payments, whether it's running at full capacity or standing half retooled for a future that hasn't arrived yet. Ford didn't lose $15 billion because it built a bad car. It lost that much because building any car in this industry means betting billions today on a future nobody actually gets to see in advance. And by the time the market tells you whether the bet was right, the concrete is already poured and the robots are already bolted to the floor. If this changed how you look at the plant that built your car, subscribe, because next time we're pulling apart another capital-intensive business where the biggest risk was never on the factory floor at all.